Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the brand new Rebel Clash stuff, go ahead and check out the Poketown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be looking at the best decks in standard post-Rebel Clash. Today was the release on PTCGO for this set, and we finally got to start playtesting with these cards. I spent, I think, 5 hours testing today on stream, mainly playing some Dragapult VMAX, but also some Turbo Zacian, the first two things that really caught my eye. But we're going to be going over all the new archetypes, where I think they rank, and ultimately how it's going to affect the current decks that we know are strong in the format. That's where we're going to start things off, looking at the top performers pre-Rebel Clash release. And this is technically in order of points earned within this format. So ADP Zacian was way out in front. It had almost 45% of the CP of every deck in total. So a really, really awesome showing from ADP Zacian. It really did clean up in this meta. The second best deck in terms of conversion and the amount of points it achieved overall was Pika Rom, and that was just over 10%. From there was Baby Blacephalon, a bunch of Mewtwo different variants, Welderbox, Cinccino Control or Mill, and then on the right, it's a bit kind of less high tier stuff, but still relevant in our format for sure. Magcargo GX, Obstagoon, Mally tags, Magcargo Mill, which actually picked up some more traction in the Limbless tournaments, the first qualifier. LucMetal Zacian, Naga Checkmate, Blacephalon GX, and ADP Spiritomb. All of these archetypes gained some CP at least within the Ultra Prism to Sword and Shield format, all except for ADP Tomb, but it did so well at the Limitless Invitational that I figured it was worth mentioning. And also it seems to be relatively strong going into the next format due to its typing as well. So now let's talk about the new introductions that I at least can foresee with the new additions from Rebel Clash. Definitely good. I believe these are going to be tier 1 or 2 contenders. And then other contenders that could be good, potentially ones that I've not been able to build correctly, but someone else might be able to, or is going to be a kind of lower tier threat that maybe you see on the ladder here and there, maybe a breakout performance in a tournament or two. But overall, it's going to be the lower tiers of play, more on the fun side of things. So for definitely good, I've got Dragapult VMAX, as well as Malamar, potentially other Dragapult builds as well. Turbo Zacian, Toxtricity, and Copperajah, so plenty of VMAXs coming into this format. Turbo Boltund, and also Colossal Sandaconda, I'm low-key kind of hyped for. For could be good, a kind of more rogue variant of Dragapult is alongside Gengar, to be a tanky build. Cinderace VMAX, again, a sort of tanking option. Inteleon VMAX, trying to be quite disruptive, and again, tanky. BoomBox is the Rillaboom deck. The Vikavolt archetype, which is trying to do big burst damage. The One Prize Dragapult, which has the new Coin Flip Whimsicott ability. Turbo Frostmoth now has buckets to try and make it a lot faster. ZapdosBeasts potentially gains a few toys now that we have Gust in a supporter back in the game, as well as Scoop Up Nets to make up for the lack of things like Escape Rope. Milotic V can potentially be a powerhouse, as can Tangrowth with some new support as well. The overall things to take away from this as the new format shapes up, Dragapult is going to be a very, very popular card. Even in the few hours that I've had today of testing it online, getting some reps in, it is clearly a very, very strong card. Doesn't need much to get set up and has space for tech supporter cards for disruption and whatnot as well. So it's naturally going to be one of the higher placing decks in this format for sure. And also just in general, there's not only Dragapult, but a handful of other VMAX Pokemon entering the meta, which can challenge Zacian's damage output in particular. Up until now, Zacian has been able to pretty much just clear the path through everything once you've done your ADP GX attack and just start churning through prize cards. The only real exceptions have been like Big Charm Swell combos from tag teams, or things like Raichu because of resistance. Now it's going to be more commonplace that things can tank, which is definitely a good introduction or few introductions to the game, because we saw just how dominant ADP Zacian was in the small amount of tournaments that we did have in our standard format. So let's start running down these brand new archetypes, starting off with Dragapult VMAX. I've kind of just put this as straight Dragapult, where really you just play a thick line of the VMAX, and then you have basically setup Pokemon from there. You use things like Mind Report Mewtwo, Oranguru, Jirachis, the Denes, and damage modifiers as well. Things like Giratina or Galarian Zigzagoon to help increase your Max Phantom bench snipe potential, basically. And the strengths really are that you have great flexible damage output. That Max Phantom is the selling point of this archetype, doing 130 to the active and 5 damage counters on your opponent's bench in any way that you like. Is super flexible, really punishing of Jirachi builds in particular, which is obviously a bunch of different archetypes out there right now. Non-GXs in general really do cower in fear of this sort of amount of spread. Obviously punishing things like Ditto Prism Star as well, naturally, which is great. And in general, just setting up 2 shots on other tankier things, or setting up things like the Dene GX for game later on as well. All good things for this sort of archetype. And that natural raw hit points of 320 basically means that unless you are either a Dark type or a Baby Blown, you're not going to one-shot this guy. So very good in general. And for weaknesses, this list can potentially be weak to Energy Denial because it's rarely playing much acceleration at all. My list plays 1 copy of the Bead Supporter, but that's really it. So if you are going to be using Crushing Hammers or Skull Grunts against them, it can be excellent. And also, it does have a relatively low damage cap, so some board-centric decks. I know things like Pika Rom adding in a Boltund, for example, can be a great way for them to reach knockouts with help of things like E-Powers, where usually it would be very difficult for the tag teams themselves to reach on a Dragapult. So simply because things stick on the board, you can try and punish them that way by getting really high damage output attacks off over a number of turns. So that's something to bear in mind. Also, healing can be an awkward thing as well. If you have a bunch of scoop up nets, if you play Malolanas in your list, you're obviously undoing turns of damage that Dragapult's trying to put on the board. So another thing to bear in mind here. For the Mally build, slightly different. You're going to have a bit of a low-key toolbox of one-prize Pokemon in here. It means that when you are up against other one-prize matchups, like that Baby Blown, for example, you can go just the Giratina Baby Blown route and just keep recharging to get them back. Also, you're much safer against Energy Denial, so there's big upsides to playing the sort of thin Malamar package, like a 2-2 or 3-3 line. That's really where I settled with my first few Theory Crafts. And also you gain things like Mimikyu, so you have potentially sometimes higher damage output when other people are swinging into your Dragapults for decent chunks, so that's also something to bear in mind. Definitely a decent option. The weaknesses, though, however, is that you're obviously less consistent than the straight Pult kind of builds because there's more janky cards in here. You do low-key rely on this Malamar, definitely in like the mid-game or so, to get some of these attackers rolling, and you don't quite have the same amount of space to try and establish things like Boss's Orders, things like Malolana. It naturally just goes more towards the actual Pokemon counts in this list. For Turbozation, this is another thing that I've tried super early on, and I still am really hyped by this archetype. You have extra prize potential in this list by trying to use Jirachi Prism Star. Now, it's been a gimmick this entire time, and it could still well end up being a gimmick, but from my first few opening games with this archetype, I believe there is some potential here for sure. And really, this comes down to tempo being a really, really important factor in this new format. With VMAXs coming out, they're able to stay out of reach of even an ADP buffed Brave Blade. So that means it's much more important for you to be Brave Blading turn 1 or 2 with this 60, because then you're taking that 2-prize knockout. Sure, you don't get the full 3 prizes of a VMAX, but sometimes you can clear threats off the board on those opening turns before they even get set up. And when you have prize cheating from Jirachi Prism now, even if it's sometimes less common or less easy to achieve this way around than using the ADP, you're just far more tempo based. And I think that's super important when we have evolutions creeping back into this format in the form of VMAXs. So I really just like the pressure you put on with this sort of build. You can try and have decent damage output with the new Galarian Meowth evolving itself into Galarian Berserker, or at least searching it out of the deck to still have that decent damage output against tag teams. It kind of depends which way the format turns. Is it going to stick to a bunch of tag team archetypes, or is it going to be mainly like VMAXs and then Zacian decks? If it is mainly VMAXs, Berserker's not all that relevant. If it's still a bunch of tag teams, Berserker still becomes super good, especially if Jirachi Prism means you can take a 4-prize knockout. It's very similar to how we've seen Beastbringer in Blacephalon work, so that then you just deal with one tag team and then you deal with Dedenne and the game's over. So yeah, I really, really do like the Scoop Up Net being a great enabler for this Jirachi Prism star, whereas previously it was a super kind of meme option. We have the Mr. Mime, the Guru, and that Jirachi Prism star, but now you have the option to Scoop Up Net back up your Jirachi Prism star, and also, rather than just professors researching away some of these combo pieces, you can put things like the Mr. Mime or the Jirachi Prism into play, and then Scoop Up Net it in the sort of like at any point during the game for when the time is right to use the combo. So I think it's a lot more viable in this new format. The weaknesses of this are obviously the attack costs are expensive and you don't have Ultimate Ray to fall back on. You're completely reliant on Intrepid Swords, manual attachments every single turn, and those saucers, so it can be a little bit more awkward. And like I said, Jirachi Prism, up until now, it's been absolute meme territory. Scoop Up Net is a phenomenal card, but it still may not be enough to carry this on its back. That being said, there's been plenty of decent Turbozation lists without this Jirachi package in this current format that have just played like Shrines and LucMetal, and making small tweaks to that could also be something that I can foresee being very, very strong. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Turbozation. I've been playing it early. I'll try and get a list out early as well, because it's one of the ones that I've tested the most like straight out the gate. Toxtricity VMAX also looks exciting. Again, it has that huge tank potential with 320 base hit points. Weakness to fighting isn't like the worst. There is a couple things that could come out that can hit you for weakness. But ultimately, you have a really good baseline of hit points. You also have a great baseline of damage output. 160 as your floor is excellent because you're already able to gust and knock out things like Dedenne. But when you add in E-powers, when you add in Garbodor / Koga's Trap, when you get that poison involved, you really are reaching scary numbers. It's just one E-power away from being able to knock out tag teams, because you have that 250, well, it's 240 base, then you have the poison tick, then you have the E-power to get you to 280. Really, really solid, and of course, you're going to play multiple E-power in the deck as well, so you could even have one turn of knocking out a VMAX, and if you're able to have one turn of knocking out a VMAX, usually that's going to put you like super, super far ahead, especially if it's things like Dragapult lists that don't have acceleration. You can really wreck them, which is just crazy good. So you pop off one turn with Toxtricity and you just become a crazy deck. You have currently the 2 Prism Stars to fall back on to make this attack cost a lot less expensive. You have the Mountain and the Coco Prism. We have Speed Energy to try and make this combo work. But at the end of the day, you are still a couple of stage 1s, so it's difficult to get rolling. You are combo reliant. You will suffer at the hands of Marnies and reset stamps at times. I think that's one of the things holding this archetype back. And at the same time, you are a multiple prize deck. You're good at doing a huge chunk of damage. You don't have much of a game plan against 1 prize decks. And I think that's going to keep Toxtricity away from the tippy top tier. But as long as Zacian and Dragapult are roaming around at the top, Toxtricity becomes a great foil for those 2 archetypes for sure. Copperajah VMAX is also an exciting one. You have a couple acceleration options. Obviously, Ultimate Ray can help you get there, as can simply just using Saucers. And its damage output is also very, very solid. One of the best selling points, really, of this is that other Zacians can't knock out your Copperajah, but your Copperajah can knock out their Zacians most of the time. Dangerous Nose does 200 base into a basic Pokemon, and if you've used an ADP GX attack, you're now able to knock out Zacian Vs, which is great. And that G-Max Hammer is also able to do the same thing, and it can even knock out 2 70 hit point tag teams post GX attack as well. So it really does hit like a truck, and it has just a huge baseline of hit points that is difficult to get through. It is a bit kind of clunky, and you're adding in spaces into your Zacian list that aren't really consistency based, so it may be a little bit awkward. Usually your opening turns want to be finding a ADP, finding a Zacian, ending on Intrepid Sword, trying to add in Copperajah steps involved there as well, maybe a little bit awkward, but the payoff can be absolutely huge. Again, just that sort of raw hit points is crazy. Even against things like Dragapult, it's an absolute nightmare for them to get through Copperajah, so yeah, he really is an annoying Pokemon to deal with. For weaknesses, ADP is a lot slower tempo-based. As I was mentioning, why I love the Zacian build right now that cuts the ADP is because tempo is way more important in this format. So relying on an ADP and then relying on a big Copperajah sometimes just isn't the right approach, so something to bear in mind. And of course, you have multiple prize Pokemon in this list, which can be punished by some cheaper and faster decks in general. For Turbo Boltund, again, it's one of these archetypes that I've been pretty excited by so far from what I've seen of it. It has tons of ways of getting energy into play. You've got the Coco Prism Star, you've got Zeraora's GX attack that you can do on turn 1 sometimes, especially with aggressive digs with Acrobikes, Researches, Viridians, which is really, really cool, and Dedennes, of course. And of course, you have Electrify as a fallback plan that at the very least gets 2 energy into play for 1 attachment, which is super easy to do. You also have really nice flexible damage output. Lightning Storm can go all over the place depending on, if you've used your Coco yet, if you've used your Mountain, if you've used all these other things. And on top of that, in security, there's also Electro Power that can scale massively as well. So your opponent is always kind of having to play on the defensive because you have potential to just draw 15 cards in a turn and find triple E power and completely blow them out of the water, which is really excellent. Also, when you're doing all this acceleration in the meantime, Boltund is a good early game, but moving into things like Choo Choo in the mid game can be an excellent option for you, just again because he's such a tanky card naturally, just a very good option to have in the deck. For weaknesses, you are quite board reliant. You need to be popping off. You need to be drawing a bunch of cards. You're probably forcing a bunch of Dedennes into play for easy prizes for the opponent sometimes. So that's something that will go against you here and there. Also, you have a low base damage. You really are reliant, like I say, on popping off. Both of these weaknesses kind of form into one. The fact that you are putting a lot of easy prizes down for the opponent because you need to draw a bunch of cards, but you don't do anything if you're not drawing a bunch of cards. So if you get some ugly hands, you're going to be very slow. Like, even Electrify, as good as the attack is, you'd rather be doing other things sometimes, like doing early prods of pressure with other attackers, or getting that big GX attack off with a Zeraora. So those are things to bear in mind, but from what I've seen so far, when it pops off, it really can just smack, and punishing Dragapult is definitely a good selling point for this archetype in the format, because Dragapult naturally wants a slower game plan, and just sitting there with a board of like 8 to 10 energies and having Electro Powers threatened as well means you can do silly things at times. Sandaconda V Colossal is the last sort of good archetype that I want to talk about. Well, I expect this to be at least reasonable, and that's because this again has that great selling point of early tempo. Sand can get yourself set up without the need for a rare candy on turn 2, which I just absolutely adore in a rare candy based deck. You also have that great typing. I'm a fan of Boltund, I'm a fan of Pika Rom, I'm a fan of Toxtricity in this format. I believe hitting all of those things for weakness is definitely a good selling point. Also, you can tech in Fire Pokemon, Ninetales V, Rallyback Entei. These sorts of cards can easily go into the list to also have decent Fire-type coverage against Zacian players. So, being a kind of dual-type option with this Colossal ability is definitely something that I'm interested in. And your raw damage output is pretty reasonable overall. I think one of the weaknesses is sometimes you are reliant on things like Diancie, Vitality Band, Martial Arts Dojo, and being behind sometimes. That's the only thing that really holds me back. And also, of course, the fact that you are Stage 2 reliant. We are in a format with Boss's Orders now. So if there are those situations where you've used Sand Breath, discarded 2 from yourself, they just gust up a Colossal and you don't have a Roly-Coly on the bench, or if you're not able to grab yourself your next Candy Colossal, you're going to be in really bad shape. So you are still, at the end of the day, at the mercy of your opponent if they can pop off with crazy turns and gusting up Colossal, because you do slow down massively if that is the case. So I think this is one of the most speculative ones that I've said in the good category. I'm a believer of it, mainly because of the relevancy of its typing and that sort of stuff. But I can certainly see this being one of the more questionable ones on the definitely good list for sure. On to the more questionable ones. Dragapult Gengar. Like I said, we know how good Dragapult V is, so leaning into that tank ability, making sure your opponent can't deal with it full stop is definitely cool. Having Scoop Up Net to pick up some of these very chunky, basic Prism Star Psychic Pokemon means that you can undo, entire turns of damage in certain situations, which is very, very cool. And as we know, Scoop Up Net is already just like a very good card in general. By playing these Prism Stars, you give yourself a natural immunity to some energy disruption options. Full Moon Star being a great option. Celtic Star, if you play energy switches, could also be a great way around Crushing Hammers or Yell Grunts, which is definitely a big selling point. So there's some cool stuff you can try and do with this Gengar overall. My issues are that, again, you're stage 2 reliant, and Gengar is super squishy. It's only got 110 hit points, so very easy to pick off from the opponent. And once that's the case, like, you can still do stuff because you're still max phantoming, but you're still in a hurry to get your next Gengar out most of the time. And you are still a little bit weak to energy disruption here and there. Less so than things like Straight Pult, where you literally have to pass into them or use Shred. But you may spend a turn using things like Full Moon Star, and that's quite slow at times. Cinderace VMAX, again, it loves to tank. It's got decent typing, obviously against Zacian, which isn't going anywhere. For weaknesses, I am worried about the lack of consistency here, because you are playing a stage 1 and you're a welder deck, so sometimes your supporter is only netting you 3 cards and you're trying to get multiple things set up, which isn't ideal. Also, you're cramming a lot of cards into your deck that aren't really consistency based, because naturally leaning into this counter attack means that you have to play a bunch of healing cards. You have to play things like Fire Crystal to recover energies if you are going to go down the Hyper Potion route, or you need to naturally keep regaining a decent hand size to make the Malolana work turn by turn by turn, because you're naturally discarding and not drawing any cards for turn with your supporter. So I think usually it's going to be a little bit less consistent than you'd like to think in general. On paper, it sounds great that you have this massive wall that you can keep healing and stuff, but in reality, you can only, like, that lock can be broken like a couple of times quite easily. And you do have, at the end of the day, a relatively low base output. The second attack, yes, it can deal with Dedenes, yes, you can deal with Zacians and stuff, but leaning into this counter means that sometimes you're just sat there poking for 30 and it's just not really that relevant. So I'm not too sold on this, but I know a few people are more excited about this guy. So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. Inteleon VMAX is disruptive. You can lean into that Hydro Snipe attack, that early 60 poke. You have Crushing Hammer, you have Team Yell Grunt potentially in the list to make that even more disruptive. We know that energy disruption is strong in the format right now if ADP remains the threat that it is, and if straight Dragapult is the main means of playing it. Also, you have decent sniping available. 160 base to the face and 60 to the bench is definitely very strong. We have things like Scoop Up Net Zigzagoon as combos now to push that 60 to a 70, which is a far scarier number in a lot of situations. So something to bear in mind. Again, my weaknesses really go back to the fact that you don't do much in those opening turns in terms of damage, and your attack cost is quite expensive. So if anything is able to come over the top and take a knockout, again, you have that annoying lightning weakness. Then you're going to, again, spend a few turns not doing much until you rebuild up that Grand Bullet. So it really can be slow on the tempo front. For Rillaboom, it does have, again, good damage output at its side. It's got a huge hit points at 330, so tanking is an option. Annoyingly, it's a grass type, so there's a bunch of things that have resistance to you, and there's also a bunch of things that hit you for weakness in this format. It's not great to be a grass type right now, I'm afraid. And you are, again, super focused on tag teams and V Pokemon and V Maxes. If you want to add in the Rillaboom, the Alolan Egg, there becomes risks in the fact that they can, again, gust your Rillaboom and then you're not playing rare candies. If you're playing the candy combo, again, there's worries of just missing it on turns and then you're left doing scratch, which is absolutely abysmal. And at the end of the day, if you come up against other 1 or 2 prize stuff, they can just be more efficient than you sometimes. So Rillaboom needs to draw well to be in the game in the first place, and also can be out-traded on by a handful of things. So overall, I think it's going to end up a little bit below the bar, especially because Rillaboom VMAX often has to discard 3 energies to do relevant damage. And then if your regular Rillaboom just gets knocked out by a boss's orders attack, then you're sat there doing nothing until you rebuild your next Rillaboom. So that's really what makes me most concerned about this list. Baby Dragapult looks interesting. It has that really annoying coin flip ability that you can prevent that damage if you flip heads, which is just really, really good, especially on a 1-prizer. Much more helpful on a 1-prize than it is a 2-prizer, because usually with more individual prizes in play, your opponent has to flip the coin more in order to win the game, so there's more chances for that to go in your favor for you to buy yourself an extra turn. So just in general, it's way better to be on a 1-prize thing than a 2-prize thing, like Whimsicott that we've seen in the past. However, you are stage 2 reliant, so that immediately eats into a bunch of your deck spaces and immediately makes you a little bit less consistent, which isn't ideal. Also, trying to be a 1-prizer in this format is really, really sketchy when Dragapult VMAX is a thing, because they can just be sniping your Dreepies with some Zigzagoon prods or some Giratina prods in addition, and not only are they threatening your active quite easily, they're also starting to threaten all your bench stuff for snipes. So that is my main concern. Also, the fact that you just have 150 hit points doesn't sound like a problem, but it actually is going into that Dragapult matchup once again, because they hit for 130, and if they have a Horror Energy on themselves, then you're not allowed to attack them. You have to have set up a second Dragapult, because otherwise you'll knock yourself out with Horror Energy, and then your Infiltrator ability won't pop off. So I think that's my biggest concern. The Dragapult VMAX matchup is probably going to be poor, but against other stuff, you're going to be super annoying. You have your own spread at your side. You can lean more into that sort of spread option with spell tags and stuff like that. So I want to give it a go, but I am skeptical just because the VMAX is probably going to be the superior build, and it's going to be favored against you. Vikavolt, again, has that huge damage output ceiling, which looks exciting. You do 60 plus 20 for each energy attached to all of your Pokemon. We've still got the battery charger bug. We've got triple acceleration as an option. So you can really push that. You know, the sky's the limit really with the Powerful Storm if you really want to lean into it as much as you can. My main issues, we're a stage 2, and not only are we a stage 2, but we've also got to fill our deck with a bunch of energies to be able to make this Powerful Storm work. So naturally, the counts of this list are going to be really awkward. It's going to be tight. You're not really going to have space for things like Boss's Orders or anything else. You're going to be trying to smack the face as much as you can and just focus on using things like Lurball to set up your next Vikavolt with all your Charger Bugs recovering and stuff like that. So it's going to require constant maintenance, and your damage output can fizzle in the late game, especially with Hand Disruption. So that's my main concern. Turbo Frostmoth does seem a lot better. It will be much, much smoother with the buckets that we get in this set, making life way easier for you to reach early damage output pressure with Keldeo. Potentially getting that GX attack off early with a Palkia could be backbreaking for certain archetypes. We've mentioned how Hammers and Yell Grunts could be interesting in this format. Palkia can do that in a very nice tempo-based way by also putting damage into play. So that's really exciting, this archetype. Still, though, my main issues are it's hard to reload once you've fronted all that energy in the first place. You then have to work towards things like Fisherman's or commit many spaces to energy retrievals that you can draw at the wrong times, and things can just go wrong with this list still. And also, the fact that Snom has 50 hit points, again, makes me very worried about the Dragapult matchup. You go second against Dragapult, you got to put down 2 Snom and just let them take sometimes like 2 prizes turn 2 immediately, because they've munched up your first Snom. Then your second Frostmoth comes into play, and they can still deal with that over a couple turns as well. So I think, again, Dragapult is just such a strong card that it pushes things like this out of the format in certain situations. ZapdosBeasts is another thing that I really want to look into. I do like its non-GX focus a lot of the time, and its type coverage is potentially very interesting. I've thought about having Zapdos alongside things like Spiritomb as well. Zapdos can be some early pressure. Spiritomb then bides its time on the bench. That gives you a slightly better time against the Dragapult matchup, thanks to weakness, of course. So that's something that I do want to look into. Again, I'm enjoying the Jirachi Prism package with Scoop Up Net. I think it is gimmicky, of course, but if you can pull it off once or twice in a game, everything just gets a better matchup against Mill, as long as you can pull off the Jirachi Prism at times. So that's what's exciting to me, really. It's basically a way of cheating against Mill that isn't ADP, and that's really something that I'm interested in, because one of the reasons why ADP has done so well in this format is because it's basically the only deck that's got a positive Mill matchup overall. And now a bunch of other decks can start doing that by going for Scoop Up Net Jirachi combos, so that's really cool. Weaknesses are your base output is, again, pretty low. You're relying on E-powers at times with the Zapdos, or you're just hoping that you can pressurize early Jirachis and stuff for tempo, and again, move into some power spike turns of Sledgehammer, Nightcap, or looking for things like Spiritomb, like I said, in that mid-game. But Zapdos gains Scoop Up Net and Boss's Orders. That basically replaces the Guzma and Escape Rope of old, so I'm excited to give it a go. Milotic V, I've already started to discredit a little bit. Initially, I saw that damage output and I thought, yeah, this is really worth building around because you reach decent numbers a lot of the time, and at the same time, you're making life more difficult for Jirachi-based engines. That is the case, but a lot of Jirachi builds, in addition to switches, now also have Scoop Up Nets, so Absol just in general becomes a weaker card in this format. So at the same time, Galamine doesn't really change the fact that they still need certain outs just to get out of the active. So it doesn't really change much just by adding extra retreat cost on. So the disruption is basically exactly the same as an Absol. And I'm also a little bit concerned that a lot of the time, your early game tempo still isn't great. I keep mentioning that word tempo. It feels like I'm just going over the same point every single time, but it's so critical in this format where ADP punishes slow decks just by not going behind in the prize race and then just like jumping straight ahead of you by cheating prizes. Or there's going to be things like Dragapult that just always basically hits 180 turn 2 on both the active and the bench in like the perfect positions, and also just like a Zacian can be smacking you now for 220 just straight out of the gate if they're going tempo based, and that's going to be just so backbreaking for these decks that really want to have a couple turns to just sit there and attach up to get themselves going. This list in particular, if you're trying to build it with ADP, you basically need to ultimate rate, otherwise you'll never get a Milotic set up in the first place, which means you need 3 turns for your ADP to stick around, which is very wishful thinking. If you're going towards Frostmoth, again, there's that issue with Snoms getting knocked out quite easily by people. Also, it takes up bench space that you'd like to be Absols or consistency cards. So overall, I'm not a huge fan of Milotic. The damage output is there, and I can see it being a bit of a glass cannon, but the consistency doesn't really back it up. Tangrowth, I think, is a little bit more consistent. Just because it's a 1 energy attacker, so it's far easier to just like drop a few Tanglers down, have a bunch of Absol and Galamine just to get things rolling. You could still play a Jirachi package just with things like Scoop Up Net rather than a skateboard, because Galamine obviously makes it impossible for you to skateboard your own stuff. But that's something to bear in mind. I think this is going to work much more often than Milotic overall. Especially because it's a one prize focus. Your Tangler has a nice 80 hit point base, which is a lot more than most other one prize decks, so you're a little bit safer against that Dragapult matchup. Especially when you have all this like trapping options available to you as well, as a potential late game win condition in certain situations where your opponent is thinking that they're ahead in a prize race. You can then just start using Boss's Orders and Tangle Drag over and over again to run them out of resources. So I think this is probably the better way of trying to make Galamine work alongside Absol. That Grass Knot can reach decent chunks, but you also have that late game win condition, which the Milotic deck doesn't really have available to it. So Tangrowth, I'm thinking is going to be a better rogue than it has been in recent times, but still, you know, has those issues of being variable damage output at times and committing a lot of spaces to things like Absol, things like Mine in high counts. So those are all like non-consistency based spots. Now that we've gone over some more questionable decks as well as some of the better decks coming out from Rebel Clash, let's return to the decks that we know and love and categorize them in one of these 4 spots: thriving, declining, non-moving, and adapting. Here is where I have placed all of these archetypes. Just a quick rundown. We've got 4 thriving decks, 3 non-movers, a couple adapting, and 6 decks that are on the decline. Like I said, Dragapult does start taking a big hold on this meta. It can be really awkward for one prize decks. It can be really awkward for Mewtwo in particular, thanks to type coverage. And that's going to be, I think, the biggest impact going into this format. So that's really been one of the main things that I believe is going to be warping the game right now. Basically, Dragapult seems to be by far and away the best new deck, and just the way it plays makes everyone else play a little bit differently at times. Let's look at Soul Burst Mewtwo. Why do I think a Mewtwo deck can continue to thrive after I just gave you a massive speech about Dragapult being awesome? Well, it's because this deck is the most versatile of all the other Mewtwo's. And in particular, thanks to Soul Burst, you can cheat some very cheeky attackers. The one I'm thinking of in particular is going to be Sableye and Tyranitar. Mega Sableye and Tyranitar tag team. If you can get a Soul Burst GX off onto that guy, you're a 280 hit point Dark type with Psychic Resistance, and you do 210 hit points with your main attack, and that's easily enough to knock out a Dragapult thanks to your weakness. And also, if they've ever had to put down Dedenne during the game, or if they've got another Dragapult that hasn't VMAXed, you can just gust that up and detonate it later on in the game. And if it's the Dedenne, you can take another 3 prizes immediately. So I believe that you're able to take the sack after Soul Burst, let them Dragapult knock out your Mewtwo, and you can still just swing the game back in your favor for 6 prizes with a lone Sableye if they don't have decent archers against it. So I really do think that's going to be the Mewtwo deck with the best matchup against Dragapult, which is pretty strange to say. Other than that, you don't gain a huge amount. Horror Psychic is potentially an option, but you're already playing a bunch of Rainbow and Aurora energies, so not a huge deal. Something you could do just because it's, one of those cards that you can pull out of the deck. Boss's Orders for slightly better gusting, potentially, than just having Snivysaur as an option. And Eldegoss V potentially getting some supporters back from that discard pile. Maybe making things like Malolana a better one-of option, just so you can use it in the late game. But it doesn't gain much. It's really just that change of the meta where Dragapult becomes a thing. I believe Soul Burst Mewtwo can have a decent time against Dragapult. So that's why I'm saying it's going to be one of the stronger Mewtwo variants going forward. And also this list appreciates the fact that other Mewtwo lists are getting way worse, because the other Mewtwo lists are worse against Dragapult, and the Soul Burst Mewtwo list isn't necessarily the best against other Mewtwo players. So I think that's also something that goes in its favor. For new threats, Toxtricity is hard for you to reach and has big damage output. You're not a huge fan of the Rillaboom deck either, just because they have those same traits going for them. And Turbo Frostmoth does seem a little bit awkward, thanks to that Palkia GX attack threat, and also the fact that they can go quite quickly with a Keldeo just rushing you down. So those are, not super high tier threats, so I think Mewtwo, in terms of meta placement, is a lot better. So I really do like that option of this list. ADP Tomb has really impressed me after seeing it do well in the hands of Ross Cawthon in the first Limitless qualifier. It does gain a handful of new things from this set as well. Scoop Up Net can be a great option for you. Boss's Orders obviously being a fantastic gust. Tool Scrapper to get rid of things like Giant Charm and Celtic Swell is a potential addition, as is Eldegoss V. If you want to have yourself better access to Boss's Orders, add in some other tech supporters as well, could be an option. Having like a one-off Guzhala that you can get back with Eldegoss, just so you can go ahead and grab your last Rainbow and your last Hustle Belt, can give you the game, basically, which is very, very cool. For new favorable matchups, it loves to see basically just multiple prize decks. Usually ADP is decent at clearing these up, and it's no real exception with Spiritomb around. Notably, I haven't put Dragapult as a favorable or a threat. I believe it will be a close matchup. Definitely in the hands of the Dragapult player to play correctly in this matchup, because damage counter placement can obviously be moved around by the Spiritomb player with a bunch of Jinx. So Dragapult making the most of their damage is going to be the key to that matchup in their position. And for the ADP player, it's all about trying to make sure that you can still burst Spiritombs out of nowhere by benching it, using a couple Jinx, using a Rainbow, using Build Spite, getting that belt on all in one turn. And if you can bop a Dragapult just from nowhere, it can be a huge threat. So I believe this seems to be okay in the meta that we were currently in, and isn't really challenged by anything in this new meta. So it seems to just be a well-placed archetype with a few additions. Seems to be very decent to me overall. Zacian LucMetal, again, one of these archetypes that only gains a couple new things. You gain that Galamine, you gain Tool Scrapper, you gain Scoop Up Net. Obviously, you gain things like Boss's Orders, Eldegoss, all the usual stuff if you want to add those in. I also think things like Scoop Up Net and Mewtwo are more likely to go into this list, because naturally Oranguru is so good with things like Metal Saucer in your 60. and potentially other options here as well that I'll mention in a second. The Jirachi Prism Star, man, I've mentioned it a lot in this video, and if it ends up flopping, I'm going to feel a little bit silly, but it's something that I like for sure in this format. So yeah, I think that's a new trait that Zacian LucMetal has that it didn't previously, where you can cheat prizes against Mill, which is a huge deal, and against one prizes, which is also a huge deal. This deck was basically the best at taking on other tag teams, and specifically ADP Zacian. I believe it had the best ADP Zacian matchup in the standard format before Rebel Clash came out. And I also think that this Energy Denial option is going to be strong against Dragapult. I've mentioned it plenty of times throughout the video. So your natural deck list right now for LucMetal is pretty solid. And if you can weave in this Jirachi, you're going to have a better time against your weaknesses currently. Or if the Jirachi Prism doesn't work out, or if you just want to accept those weaknesses, you can just stay as you are, and you end up still becoming that anti-meta play where you're decent against Turbo Zacian, you're decent against Dragapult, and you're decent against ADP builds. That's like such a good meta place to sit at. You just have to dodge things like Baby Blounds, basically, and that's not the worst spot to sit in, really. Also, the only real new threat is another fire deck, but that's no real news to you. So yeah, I think overall, LucMetal Zacian seems to be a very, very strong play right now. Pika Rom gains some great stuff in the set, to be honest. Boltund V, like I said, can be a great way to threaten Dragapult after using a couple full blitzes. Speed Lightning Energy just improves your full blitz odds, and I think that's my favorite thing of this, really. Its damage output is still like reasonable. As long as tag teams are still in the format, it's going to be fine. Tag Bolt is still obviously a great option, so that's not going to be a huge issue. I think really just getting yourself an extra buff towards a turn 1 full blitz is just such a big deal. You also gain Boss's Orders, potentially Tool Scrapper as well, just for like big charms. Eldegoss V being able to help you like clear up the game, definitely decent options for you overall. For favourables, you like seeing a small shift towards the bucket and a few additions to water, but not too much in general. For new threats, Toxtricity is just bigger than you a lot of the time, so you're the one having to push harder and dig for more combo pieces. Zacian, I also believe, could be a little bit awkward for you. Yes, they don't have the damage buff of the ADP, that could be a little bit awkward for them, but that Jirachi Prism Star stealing prizes and then basically just being able to turn 1 full blitz you, but with a Zacian instead, is equally scary. And low-key, you're a little bit worried about the Sandaconda deck, at least on PTCGO. But yeah, I think the odds of a turn 1 full blitz increasing just naturally makes this deck stronger. That's really all that matters to me, because your win rate, like Pika Rom's win rate when it gets turn 1 full blitz going second, is just like, it's really, really high. So giving yourself an extra couple draws to make that a reality is just a real treat for the deck. So Pika Rom still seems very, very solid to me. For the non-movers, it feels weird to put ADP Zacian in non-mover category because it gains a lot of things, it gains a lot of options, but also there's a few worries for me here. I've mentioned it a few times, ADP's GX attack feels a lot slower in this format than it used to, because there are things that just outscale Brave Blade's damage output now. So I'm personally a little bit concerned about ADP Zacian going forward. I still believe it's probably the best answer that we have to Mill. I still think it's going to be great against one prize decks, but I do think you are a little bit more worried about some of these things that just have an annoying amount of hit points. There's the Cinderaces out there, there's the Toxtricities. Turbo Zacian as well, I believe, is a really hard matchup for you. If they get one Jirachi Prism off, you pretty much always lose that game, which is pretty rough. I think there are some great new additions. I think Scoop Up Net's pretty much a no-brainer for ADP Zacian. It's going to love trying to use that card. I think Tool Scrapper can be nice for Big Charm Swell, but so often during this video I've mentioned that Mewtwo is going down in popularity, so you're not really countering much with Tool Scrapper in the format. I made it pretty clear in my set review video that I don't think Tool Scrapper will be making it into like any of my deck lists. Boss's Orders, obviously great Gust. You can add in Mewtwo combo with your Scoop Up Nets, because again, Oranguru is naturally very strong here. You can try and have that Copperajah, so you have a tank on your own side for mirrors, so that's going to be interesting to see how that develops. Overall, I think it doesn't change like a huge amount, because there's not much space to wiggle around. naturally having to have, you know, all those acrobikes, those spinners, the dual energy and stuff. But I think the stuff that we do get is really high quality, so ADP Zacian's probably going to end up still being like just fine. And it's not like you can't win against Dragapult or anything like that. You might just have to play slightly differently. There'll be situations where you've gone second, you've got a hand that makes you think that you're like close to getting a turn 1 KO, and you go for that instead of the Alter Creation GX attack. You have to play a lot more board-based rather than just like, it's my turn 1, let's attach to an ADP. It's my turn 2, let's attach to an ADP and GX. I feel like you're going to be actually having to use your brain in a lot of matchups now, which sounds bad because you didn't have to too much in this format. But like, against stuff that can then evolve out of your reach, it might be way more tempting for you to just like bum rush a Zacian attack and then try and weave in the GX attack later. So stuff to bear in mind for sure. Blacephalon gains basically nothing, I think. Eldegoss V seems like the strongest card for this deck, and that's probably just going to be a one-of, but it is, at the end of the day, a ball search out to Welder, and sometimes just Welder is like game for you. Ninetales V is another potential addition. It can help out in some strange matchups, like you can copy some Dragapult attacks at times, or you can try and do some resource managing of your own against control decks, and that's something that you haven't really had an option for in Blacephalon previously, which is pretty cool. Boss's Orders, now I'm not sure if that's going to go in the list or not, but it is an option there. It might end up being just like a one-of. For new threats, you don't like Mally Dragapult too much because they're basically just a Mally list in general, which is slightly unfavorable, I would say. And if other one-prize decks like Zapdos come into the fray, they're probably going to have a good time against you because Blacephalon really isn't a Puritan one-prize deck anymore. It's usually committing to Oricorio and Dedenne and Zacian. So, yeah, normally you're going to be a little bit less Puritan than them. For new favourables, you love seeing things like Copperajah and the Rillaboom. They're easy targets for you, and just the VMAXs in general you can hit pretty nicely and uptrade on. I think usually this card is like, this archetype isn't changing too much, like maybe 3 cards change, possibly adding in Scoop Up Nets as well. I should have put that as a new addition because that could easily go into the list also if you want to get a little bit more creative. So yeah, I think that's all for Blacephalon. It can still uptrade. I haven't figured out how strong it is against the Dragapult matchup so far in my encounters with it when I've been playing the Dragapult side. There's been a couple of games where I've stomped it because my early pressure on their like Jirachi engine has been too strong. And there's been games where they hit 7 energy turn 2 and then the Dragapult player basically just folds immediately. So I haven't found out how much Blacephalon needs to high roll in order to win. But if the Dragapult deck continues to play like a high count of Marnie, like 3 or 4, which is pretty much what we've been seeing from Japan, it's a little bit worrying for Blounds overall. Welderbox, I believe, is pretty much just fine again. Similar to Blounds, it only gains those couple of cards, really. I still believe you'll be using the Ninetales gusting option rather than Boss's Orders, because Welder is too important for you to not play each turn. It's still not a bad typing to be, of course. Rillaboom, Copperajah, Zacian, if these archetypes end up being strong, you're going to be happy about it. You're not too happy about water stuff coming in, and things like Tangrowth could also be an issue for you as well, because you're a bunch of basics with high retreat cost, and you're super Jirachi based. But overall, I don't see Welderbox, again, changing too much. Potentially, you can add in Scoop Up Nets in addition to switches now for additional outs, but that's really about it. I am a little bit concerned that you naturally are forced to put down a bunch of Dedennes, and you're naturally forced to put down a bunch of Jirachis. That's basically just food for Dragapult, so that's a little thing to bear in mind. Cinccino Mill is one of the most interesting things for me. It gains potentially a long list of cards. Boss's Orders plus Galamine is a new defensive combo that you have at your disposal to force your opponent to find switching outs, which is interesting. You gain Capture Energy, which can give you really, really easy means of finding Zacian or early Mincinos in addition to Quick Balls, so your consistency and whatnot goes up, which is really excellent. You're less worried about getting donked. I believe Capture Energy probably will go into the list over the Recycle Energy that we're seeing currently, just because it's so good in the early game. Curse Shovel's an option for additional mill. Clefable is another option that you can use with Scoop Up Net to try and use alongside your hammers or alongside your Yell Grunts to remove energies from the board, which is excellent. And Tool Scrapper is potentially a better option than Faber because you're not spending your supporter for turn, which is potentially good for, again, some disruption, removing switching outs, etc. You are a little bit worried about Dragapult, realistically. I think it's slightly different to the ADP matchup where you can just remove energies for a long time and they're just simply doing nothing, because Dragapult at least has a 1 energy attack cost. Even the regular V just has 1 for 30, which gets through Dolls. The Shred just does 60. It's like two-shotting a Rangaroo, even if you are using a Yell Grunt every single turn. So you trying to stem the pressure of a Dragapult is way harder than stemming the pressure of an ADP, in my opinion. And as soon as they are at that 2 energy, 3 energy count, like, the game becomes very difficult for you. They're ignoring Dolls most of the time. They can use Boss's Orders and kill, like, double Cinccino on certain turns. And your engine does start to crumble apart at times. So I am a little bit concerned about Dragapult. I don't think it's unwinnable by any means. But I think the Malamar list should definitely cause you huge headaches. The straight list, possibly you can outrun them with a bunch of Clefables and stuff if you pop off early game. But I do think that is certainly a worry. Also, I think you're a little bit worried about Ninetales V, and Rillaboom's another one of these decks that's probably playing the Snivysaur package, so something to bear in mind. Overall, I think with Boss's Orders becoming a thing, Dolls do seem a little bit less safe, and I think Spaces are probably going to be better used by trying to add in more energy disruption or this Boss's Orders Galamine combo and just making that something that you do every single turn, force your opponent to find another switch, another scoop up net, in addition to energy attachments, and basically make them play things like Professor's Research. If you make people play researches, it's like you've just done a Belelba twice immediately. So Boss's Orders can be insane value at times if you just get your opponent in an awkward hand position. So I think that's where Mill is going to go in the future. Obstagoon's another one that's quite interesting to me. I think Obstruct gets way, way worse as long as the VMAXs start to succeed. If Dragapult is very good, that's going to be an issue for you. The Obstruct that we know and love for just saying no longer really does the job for you. So if Copperajah starts getting teched in, if good old, Toxtricity starts coming into lists, Obstruct is just not a safe option anymore. For me, I think you probably have to go back towards adding in your Sableye Vs and a few other pieces here and there, and become a bit more of an aggressive archetype, because you can't really sit there and hope that Obstruct just wins you the game naturally. There are a couple nice additions. Scoop Up Net is really, really good for Obstagoon, because potentially it's extra damage counters that you can burst on people, and we've seen people resort to Virizion GX to remove Pokemon from play. Now you can Lone Goon yourself out of nowhere a lot more easily with Scoop Up Net as a combo, especially with things like Rosa being able to get you, like, that piece, and you can also, like, remove your doll from play at the same time. So I think the concept of the Virizion GX will now evolve into using Scoop Up Nets to remove stuff from play, which is definitely a cool option for you, so that sounds very exciting. There are a handful of other archetypes coming out in this set which are just going to be basics, so you will be able to capitalize on those. But as long as these VMAXs are a thing, you're probably going to have to try and race them. Try and use your Yveltal, try and use Sableye, maybe even adding in some energy acceleration is going to be the direction that Obstagoon needs to go in the future. On to some of the declining decks, I think ultimately these are going to be quite obvious. Mewtwo Welder is not going to appreciate Dragapult at all. I think going forward you need to play Cinderace GX or Weak Guard. Both of these have massive drawbacks, just naturally. There are new additions to Mewtwo Welder, but ultimately I'm going to try and keep these short and sweet because I've already been rambling for a long time. I just think the type coverage of Mewtwo Welder ultimately just doesn't really make me too excited about playing this archetype at all. So yeah, I'm just going to say that it's more likely that the Ability Zard is going to survive over Mewtwo Welder. For Mewtwo Mally, I'm a little bit less skeptical that it's going to survive, but I do think it will go slightly on the decline just naturally because Dragapult is such a difficult matchup. Right now in the format, Mally Mewtwo isn't too successful, and that's in a spot where there's no real bad matchups for it. Like, the worst matchup right now for Mally Mewtwo is like straight Malamar, and even then you have like just the Dust mains, the Dust Noirs that you can try and use. Obviously, Mewtwo Mally can try and go up against Dragapult just using Dusknoirs and your Gengar, Mimi, but I think ultimately you end up spending a bunch of deck spaces for like lack of consistency options, so I think that is a bit of an issue. I said that Dragapult V could be a card in your list, not the VMAX, literally just like one of V, so you can be decent in like mirror situations, and also just 140 for 2 is actually like fairly efficient, and the Mewtwo deck is actually looking for efficient attackers at times, so that's quite a funny addition that you could have. Obviously Mewtwo can't copy the Dragapult, you have to physically use it, but just something to bear in mind. Could be interesting, but overall I'm a little bit worried about about Mewtwo in general. Magcargo GX, I'm again a little bit skeptical of, mainly just because Dragapult VMAX, having a 90 hit point Pokemon as your draw engine is very worrying, because you're going to get crumbed by that Boss's Orders, or you're going to get crumbed by that Dragapult so frequently that you're just going to sit there with bad hands sometimes. Dragapult VMAX, it's so ruthless when it plays a really high Marnie count and is able to just ruin your draw engine like very, very quickly. It's just a real problem. So I think any deck trying to focus on some of these lower hit point draw engines is just going to really get punished by the archetype. Also, I think just in general, higher hit points coming into the game, it's forcing you to draw even better, forcing you to get optimal setups, and the new cards from Rebel Clash, nothing's really good for setup for this deck. So your engine's basically identical to what it was before, and essentially just more threats come out in the game. Mally tags, I think, is in a strange spot. Again, it doesn't really gain much on its own end. Capture Energy could end up being a one-of addition rather than the Recycle Energy that we've seen previously, just because it is so important to find Inkays on turn 1. I don't think Capture Energy is ever going to be more than like a 2 count, but it could end up being that identical 2 count just to get more Inkays into play. Horror Psychic, again, like, I don't think it's better than Capture Energy, but it is more damage counters, so something to bear in mind. Boss's Orders is actually a really nice card for Malamar because it's so board-centric that you can literally be in situations where you just Stellar Wish and then you can like find your Boss's Orders, recharge, play a Boss's Orders, no questions asked. You don't need a hand sometimes with Malamar, so that boss is actually a really nice addition to Squids, even if it is going to be like a one-of, similar to how we've seen Great Catcher in the past. For threats, things like Scoop Up Net could be a real problem because they can mess with your usual spell tag shenanigans and your usual Distortion Door. Malamar is normally quite precise with how it maps out its 6 prize cards, and it's usually like on a knife edge whether or not it makes it in time. So Scoop Up Net just undoing even like 5 damage counters can be the difference between a win and a loss, so I think that's a bit of a concern. Also, just a small meta shift in general. Malolana is really good in the format when Dragapult is one of the main attackers. Zacian just naturally likes playing Malolana in its deck anyways. And if more Boss's Orders are going to be in stall variants, I think Malolana is just a super good card going into this format. So that just naturally kind of like counters Mally in many ways. So that's something to worry about. So I think Malamar as we know it, going to be on the decline. Magcargo Mill, just like I said with Magcargo, the aggressive list, the GX, you are a little bit concerned that your engine is going to get wrecked. Mareeps are just not safe at all, and Magcargo is not safe at all with the Boss's Orders around as well. Just like I said with the Cinccino, you do get Capture Energy, which I think is low-key really, really excellent for Mill, and Boss's Orders for trapping stuff. Naturally, though, you were trying to trap anything in the active with Fluffy Pillow, so it's not like as big of a deal for this type of Magcargo Mill. So that's the main concerns I have. Also, the Fluffy Pillow in general gets worse as Malolana, plus Mewtwo becomes potentially a combo in many decks. Mewtwo/Eldegoss, I should say. Naga Checkmate, I'm very concerned about. If Tool Scrapper actually becomes a card in the format, the whole win condition of Naga Checkmate like kind of goes out the window. Dragapult naturally can take multiple prizes in a turn, like 3 or 4 prizes in a turn if it really has to. And at the same time, ADP Zacian, if they do end up playing Tool Scrapper, they can just Scrapper, take 3 prizes after you've used Stinger, and it's game over basically. So although you are still decent against traditional prize racing decks, and you do gain things like Capture Energy, like I keep saying, which is great for you getting extra Pokemon into play and making your early game way more consistent, I think it just becomes a huge risk if you're awkward against the two best decks in the format, basically. Blacephalon GX also seems to be on the decline. It's just naturally getting pushed out the meta, really. Dragapult's another one of these cards that can avoid Beast Ring quite easily, doing 130 active and 50 to the bench. Yeah, that's really, really easy for them to jump Beast Ring, because they can just Gust, then the Blam gets knocked out by the Sprinkle, and whatever they've hit into the active with the Gust can then get knocked out, and you've jumped Beast Ring. So, yeah, that seems very, very awkward for Blown. There's a handful of water things coming out as well, potentially. So there's a bunch of reasons why Blacephalon isn't doing well right now in the format, and it's just going to continue to be the case. I think, yeah, Blown is kind of getting pushed out at this point, which is a little bit sad, but there you are. Right, that's each individual deck discussed. Hopefully I went into enough detail on all those things. If there was anything that I didn't go over, or if there was anything that I should have added, make sure you get it down in the comments below. Always happy to discuss it there. However, my general thoughts on the new Rebel Clash meta are these. Firstly, Gust becomes much more universal and much more frequent. Although people are probably only going to play 2 or 3 counts of Boss's Orders, there's most likely going to be Eldegoss V running around, or Mewtwo plus Scoop Up Net combos. That's the one I pretty much prefer personally right now. That does mean that, you know, bench sitters are going to be a lot less safe, and they can be targeted a lot more frequently, which is a big concern. Also, it means Pokédoll is a far less strong card in this format, which is, for me, I'm very happy about it. We've seen Pokédoll be dominant in a handful of archetypes already, so seeing that become less strong is definitely something I'm excited for. However, just because dolls get weaker does not mean that Mill gets weaker. They can also use Boss's Orders against you and use that for trapping shenanigans, so that's something I would certainly bear in mind. Spending on a supporter, or spending Gust as your supporter will also lead decks in general probably down more ability-based engines, just because you need to still find your turn attachment. You still need to find your evolution. You still need to set up your benched Pokemon. You still need to prepare yourself around Reset Stamp whilst using a supporter not drawing cards. So I think ability-based and item-based draw cards get way better. The first few decks I've built have all played 4 Acrobikes, because I want to be using Boss's Orders. I want to have the option to Boss Orders as much as possible, so I can really push the advantage when I'm ahead. So Acrobikes just help you see more cards in those early turns, which is never a bad thing, but also means in that mid-game, when you're still trying to find pieces, you can draw a handful of cards and still get that Boss's Orders off. So I do think in general those decks are going to thrive. And any decks, like I said, that can just sit with things on board that are low maintenance, they're also going to have a natural advantage. If you're happy just turn attaching and playing a Boss's Orders, you're going to be in good shape in a lot of situations. And spoilers, a lot of the time, that's some of these tag team decks. That's the things like your Pika Roms, that's your Dragapults, that's your Toxtricities. Sometimes, because you've just sat there and absorbed a hit thanks to your huge hit points, you can just go, okay, cool, Gust this turn, kill your best guy, and that's sometimes just excellent. Scoop Up Net is a card, again, that I'm enamored by. I've talked about the Mimi Jirachi combo way too much already in this video, but more realistically, there's things that you can do with Mind Report Mewtwo, there's things you can do with Jirachi as well. Those are going to be some real big key parts of this format, and it makes those cards just, again, even better. Even some tech one-ofs like the Enhanced Hammer Giratina could be creeping into lists as well, so do be aware of that. On a side note, I think Absol gets way weaker in this format from what I've noticed early on, and that's because people have 3 to 4 switch outs plus 2 to 3 Scoop Up Net outs. So yeah, Absol seems way, way worse, and potentially even things like Malolana outs, so just something I've noticed. And the final point here is that the VMAXs start to enter the meta finally. They were introduced in Sword and Shield, weren't all that impressive, but now we really are going to start seeing the impact of these high hit point Pokemon taking shape in the game. Thanks so much for watching, guys. My voice has died a couple times, but it's been good to start talking about this. I've waited a long time to get into the Rebel Clash stuff, but I'm super excited that we can get into it in more detail now. Expect a handful of deck videos throughout this week, and I will be doing a buy list as soon as possible as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in another video tomorrow.